it sounds like you're saying now's a great time to buy. If now's such a great time to buy, how come there's so much property on the market?
One of the key things we've been talking about recently, house prices in New Zealand have doubled every 10 years for the last 4 decades.
Yeah.
So it will forever and forever. And I'm a big hater of that saying, mostly because it has done that. That's a true statement. And so we've been stepping through why is that. Generally, it's the significant falling of interest rates over that period of time, over multiple decades. The other one is a land use and restriction on land use. Doubling of household incomes. What does that do? If you double your household income, your borrowing power increases, you can borrow more, you can pay more for a property. And again, it comes to the productivity side of things, right? You go and work more, you don't get much more because you just get taxed more. Yeah. So if we shift that towards some form of wealth, land or capital growth tax, then you might see that also contribute to less growth in the future. Can you buy now, right now? Oh, I don't have a 20% deposit. 40% of all first home buyers right now are buying with less than a 20% deposit.
Wow.
So you don't need a 20% deposit. And in fact, almost half of all are not using it. Six months ago.
Sitting on a real estate gold mine, you've got an absolutely stunning $10 million property on Waiheke Island. By the way, I look forward to seeing you later on. What exactly is the golden visa?
It's a little bit deep conversation.
It's good. We're going to shift gears. We're shifting gears. Settle in, Nick. Settle in. Welcome to Home Run. Today, we're with Nick Goodall. Nick is head of research at CoreLogic. He's got his own podcast. Nick, maybe if you could just give us a little bit of who you are and what the audience is likely to get out of our conversation today.
Yeah, for sure. So, work for CoreLogic. So we're a property data information company. We're all about getting the data that we have, all the complex information, and bringing all that together and serving up that to people to make smarter decisions, essentially. Calvin's our chief economist and myself as head of research. We do a weekly podcast called the New Zealand Property Market Podcast, where we essentially catch up on all the data that's relevant for the market and then talk about our expectations for essentially what's going to happen next in the market. So yeah, nice to always catch up and talk about what's going on.
Oh, fantastic. Well, we look forward to having you here, and so nice to have you here, especially when it comes to a lot of data and we talk about stats all the time, and it'll be really good to understand from your perspective on what those numbers actually mean, because I'm sure there'll be a lot of people that look at numbers and they get overwhelmed by it.
Yeah.
And it'd be great to understand from your perspective as to what that actually means.
Yeah, of course.
To people.
Yeah, look, I think when we summarise the market high level to start with, it's really about how things have improved in the last year. We've seen this market start to grow. The first few months of this year, we've finally sort of seen some growth come back to the market. So we just released our home value index. Much of that data is available on our website. And we've seen a 0.5% growth in March, following a 0.4% growth in February. So we've seen some growth come back to this market. It did follow a pretty tough market in 2024. Transactions have lifted. Now values are starting to grow as well. But in terms of setting expectations, we also expect that the market's not going to take off again because there are these sort of conflicting forces that are sort of fighting against the market at the same time. So much improved on last year, but not going to take off like we've seen in previous cycles.
Those numbers, what is the context of those numbers? Is that over a 12-month period, month on month? Are they seasonally adjusted? I think December and January are weird months for real estate.
Yeah, our home value index, we don't seasonally adjust it. It is supposed to account for the fact that we'll see different types of properties selling over time. And so we don't seasonally adjust that index itself. It's using hedonic methodology, which we're not going to go into the detail of all of that stuff. Hedonic. So essentially it's building up all the characteristics of a property to try and value everything within that property and how that's changed over time based on what people are paying for properties more recently. So without going into a full statistical understanding of that, we believe, and there's quite good academic research that says hedonic index is a best way of measuring value change over time. Certainly better than using a median sale price, which only measures what happens to be selling over time. And that can change quite dramatically month to month, quarter to quarter, year to year. And so we don't seasonally adjust that. So when we have seen growth, we see it as real growth. And so that's why we're confident to now say the downturn has ended. We're now in the next phase, which is some growth in this market. And then it's about what that growth looks like.
So new financial year, new market.
That's right. Yeah, I think so. And I think when you look at transactions as well, that's the other thing we look at. Many economies and many industries are determined by how many transactions are happening in real estate. Now, some of the non-sympathizers will say, what does it matter? It's only how many real estate agents are selling property and how much commission they're getting, right? But there's much more of our economy that's reliant on transactions in the economy or transactions in the property market, whether it's banking, whether it's movers, stages of houses. There's so much of our economy which is based upon transactions occurring in the property market. And so when we see growth in transactions, that's generally a good story for our economy and for GDP growth as well, which everyone knows we've been in a long recession. We need to see growth back out of that recession, and that's a real key part of it. So when I put numbers on that, we saw roughly 82,000 transactions last year, residential transactions. Our expectation based on our forecast is for that to lift to 92,000 this year, so a 12% lift, and then a further growth into 2026 as well.
So that 12% lift from 82,000 to 92,000, what is that relative to the historical context? Is 82,000 a low number?
Very.
Normal? It is a low number. So 92, is that a low number?
Just below the multi-decade average. So we sort of say a normal market or an average market in New Zealand is about 95,000. So we'll be just below that this year. So getting back to some level of normality, expectation for that to grow above 100,000 next year.
Right.
And so we'll be above that growth.
Inflationary pressure, do you think when you have a higher volume of sales, do sale prices follow?
Generally, yeah. So what we see is transactions pick up. That means there's more activity. That means there's more competition. That generally means prices follow. Not to the same level maybe. So if we see another 10% lift in transactions this year, or 12%, we might see that equate to a 5% growth in property values.
Right.
So that's our central scenario. There's obviously some upside and downside risk to that, and it will vary by region, by month. It won't be a straight line. It never is.
Yeah.
But I think that's our central scenario, that we will see around about 5% growth in property values throughout this calendar year.
So we're predicting slight uplift of values and transactions, but actually the number of transactions still just a scratch below kind of historical normal.
Exactly.
Yeah. And I guess there is never any normal. There's always sort of some movement. It really isn't there. But I guess I'm curious to just get your take, like on the market forces right now. And you mentioned before there's some constraints. So maybe can you talk us through what are the things that are both bringing the positive aspects and those dampening effects?
Yeah, absolutely. I think the number one factor that's leading to more transactions and increasing prices is falling interest rates.
Yeah.
It's improved affordability. As mortgage rates fall, we can then borrow more money, so our borrowing power increases, and we then go and pay more for properties. That's the number one thing that's leading to prices increasing this year compared to what was happening last year.
So you think prices are increasing right now?
Yes, absolutely.
Across the board of New Zealand?
Mostly. It's not fully translatable, of course. We're going to see some variance across different parts of the country, but we are seeing growth in those main centres. Auckland, Hamilton, Wellington, Christchurch have seen decent growth so far this year. And then some of the regions may be flattened out. But so they've stopped declining, but they're just flattened out a little bit. Now, they're determined based on economies that are happening around there, whether they're local economy, whether they're based on farming or tourism. All these things are going to have a factor because people working in those areas are either confident or not confident to go out there, get a mortgage and buy a property. So there's lots of nuance there, and I'm not going to be able to give a full overview of every part of the country, but I think those people that are based in those centres, they know what's contributing to their economy. I'm based in Wellington, for example. It's pretty, quite a lot of coverage that the public sector isn't going so well right now. Government has definitely pulled back in fiscal spending and cutting some jobs through that public sector. That's flowing through to the private sector as well. And so Wellington's definitely got a bit of more uncertainty hanging over its head than, say, Auckland, which has got a much more robust economy, much more international as well. And so we're seeing that growth come back in Auckland.
Although I would say, like I see in Auckland, the apartment market is substantially different than, just more traditional type of housing. And there's a huge variance based on suburbs and even the different price points there. I think will be interesting because we've got the time and we want to get into the kind of nitty gritty of some of those centres. And we could talk about a few of them, but maybe before we get right into the weeds, let's just hit the key things that you kind of look at. You said before with you've got the hedonistic,
hedonic, that's it.
Index in terms of being able to track growth trends. What are the other metrics that you track in order to make those forecasts?
Yeah. I mean, for the hedonic model itself, the good thing with that is we actually do split value change by property type as well.
Okay.
And even better than that, and I'm sure we can bring up a screenshot of this, but we actually also publish it by suburb. So not only by city for all of Auckland or all of Wellington, you can now go on our website and you can look at what's happened with the last month of values, 3 month, 12 month, by property type. So you can see what houses are doing compared to, say, townhouses. And it's all on a nice map as well. So you can sort of pick apart different trends too and go, Central Auckland's doing quite well now right now, but some of the eastern bays haven't seen that growth come back.
Yeah.
And that could be impacted by more apartments in the central city, by being more expensive out in the eastern bays, and that has an influence on where that growth's coming back to. And that's probably maybe we can then talk about the different types of buyers that are out there, and that we've seen first-home buyers have remained relatively strong. They're always looking long-term. They're willing to adjust their expectation. And so they kind of do anything they can to get into that market. And I'm sure you guys see this on a regular basis as well. We're also seeing those investors come back. Now, the really interesting thing with those two buyer groups is they typically tend to play in the same part of the market, that lower to middle part of the market. And so we're seeing more growth come back in those areas than we are, say, in the more expensive market, where maybe owner-occupiers moving house would be as they upgrade properties or do things like that too. So those are the other factors that we're trying to track and go, there's some pent-up demand coming from those movers that haven't moved.
Yeah.
What are the areas of the market they're going to be buying, and what types of properties, what parts of the city might they be active in the coming months and coming quarters?
Yeah, and the tool that you've got on the website is really intuitive. I actually played around with it the other day, and it's so cool to actually drill down to a suburb level, and it's color coded as well. So it's really easy on a snapshot to see. Is that till 12 for the past 12 months? You can
see 12 months. You can see the median value of all properties in that suburb right now.
Yeah.
Then you can see change over 1, 3, and 12 months.
Yeah.
So you can really get a feel for how those trends are occurring,
exactly.
what differences might be happening across different parts of the city as well. So
exactly. It's really intuitive to cool. It's really good for an average Joe to be watching that and like drilling down to their own suburb level and going, this is what's been happening, and to have that tool at hand is amazing.
Yeah, and I think depending on how into the market people are, they might look at that and go, it's really interesting. Maybe 1 or 2 suburbs in an area haven't seen the same growth as those around it.
Correct.
If you know that area, you might know it's because the connections to transport isn't so good, or they don't have local access to shops or something, or schools, right?
Yeah.
So you know why they haven't been maybe growing by the same, or you go, that's weird, they're not. Maybe they're due for some growth to come, and so then you can start to find opportunities with that too. But you can't beat that local knowledge, and that includes understanding local economies, but also just being out there and looking at properties, seeing what's selling, and really getting on the nitty-gritty of what's on the market, what's selling, how much are they selling for, and who's buying them, and talking to people in the market too, whether it's agents, mortgage advisors, they're onto the market as well. So all of that knowledge is really useful.
Yeah.
You mentioned interest rates as the first thing that's kind of fueling the green shoots of some growth there. What are the other metrics that you pay attention to in this 5% forecast?
Yeah, I think the key other things that are contributing is the expectation around our economy growing. So again, so our economy does better, we do better, and so we start to be out there purchasing property. But then there's some things that fight against it. And those things are things like the high level of listings right now. So it means there's lots of buyer choice. There's not that same desperation. If you're looking to buy a property, you don't feel like you have to pay any price the vendor asks you. You can maybe wait and see what comes up down the road.
Totally.
So I think that the fact that we've got that buyer choice means that people aren't desperate and paying crazy prices like maybe they were back in the COVID days. And so the market's taking a little bit of time to turn over. Better than last year, but not quite as good as it could otherwise be. And I think affordability is still relatively stretched right now too. So, when I talk about declining interest rates, that does mean we can get a larger mortgage because our payments are higher. But also, when you look at long-term affordability, we're still above the long-term average. So we talked about the long-term average of transactions.
Yeah.
The long-term affordability picture, and we can probably bring up a chart about this as well, shows that right now, I think about the proportion of income required to service a mortgage sits around about 47% right now.
Right.
It's below the peaks that we saw sort of last year or two, 53, 54%, but it's still above the long-term average of around about 43%. So it's improved, but we're still squeezed in terms of how much we can borrow and how much we can pay. And that's just going to hold back some of that growth as well.
Yeah, so it's actually, because that is sitting above the average, that's actually not inflationary. And I guess another factor that may prevent it from being more inflationary, even if it was a smaller percentage, maybe it marries up to the debt to income ratios.
Yeah, that's certainly something. I think that's the thing that's being tested right now, is that right now, more conversations are probably about what is the serviceability test rate of the banks, and how much does that mean?
Interest rates now, you can get 4.99.
Yeah, but you're still being tested around 7 or 7.5.
Yeah,
and so I think for an income there, you're still having to convince the bank you could pay a mortgage at 7%. That's still a little bit restrictive. Likely to come down a little bit further, and we've seen some news even this week where some of those test rates have come down a little bit further. But now, as you can start to borrow more because those test rates come down, now the debt to income restrictions come in. So for a bit of explainer, debt to income restrictions are now in play. The Reserve Bank brought those on the 1st of June last year. That means that as an owner-occupier, high debt to income means more than 6 times your income. For an investor, it's 7 times your income. And so if your test mortgage rate has you paying more than that or borrowing more than your income, 7 times your income, you then can't necessarily get that. But there is a speed limit. And so there's a 20% speed limit. Banks can do 20% of all lending outside of 7 times your income for an investor. Right now, it's around about 5 to 7%. So there is still room to move there. But especially by the second half of this year, the banks are then going to actually be declining people and saying, we can't lend to you because we've already maxed out the speed limit. And so investors won't be able to get lending above that amount. So it's going to be another restriction on the market that we haven't seen before. And again, when we think about things capping that growth rate, that's one of those factors that will come into play in the second half of this year.
Pretty interesting. It's fascinating, it's a new thing that's in the property cycle. And also, I guess, the question mark around interest rates, where they're sitting, is that high relatively, or is it about right? Because I think it depends on who you ask. If I ask my parents, they say, well, we pay 20%, 5% is cheap. But if you ask the people of the last 5 years, oh my God, interest rates are still so high. Where do you think the new normal will be?
Yeah, I think that's where the affordability question comes in, because if you measure affordability, I'd say on 2 things. What is the house price to income ratio? So how much does the house cost compared to the median household income today? And then what is the proportion of income required to service a mortgage? Because that takes into account interest rates, which the first measure doesn't do. When you start to understand that, that's when you start to understand the long run context and go, are things actually more affordable today? Could we see more demand than we've seen in the past, which would see upward pressure on prices? And so I think that's the key thing for me, because one of the things I think we've said for maybe 6 months now is that because there's been lowering interest rates and increasing almost vibe, right? Like the expectation on capital growth has come back. But it's that people want to buy property because they can see it's improved now than it was in the last couple of years. But how do we turn that willing demand, I want to buy property, into real demand, I can afford to buy property? And that's where those affordability metrics start to come in. So if you put that in that context, we're above that long-term average. We're better than the last 2 years, but we're not as good as we were in, say, 2013.
Real estate agents, there's your answer. I say this because I've been chatting to agents recently. I call auctions and I'm doing plenty.
Yes.
So I had lots of conversations with salespeople. And, if I rewind maybe probably 2 months ago, I'm having agents say, I'm getting really good numbers through. This is like week 1. I've had such great numbers through the campaign, but I'm feeling frustrated because the buyers aren't getting back to me. They're not buyers. They're people who want to buy. They're out there researching the market, but they haven't yet even worked out whether they can afford to buy or not. They just think, now's maybe the right time.
Exactly. And that's good too, right? Like you should go out there and test before you're ready. I mean, the sooner you go and talk to someone about financing, the better as well, because you might find you can afford to buy even though you're not sure about it. But then I think there is still that little difference between willing demand and real demand.
Yes.
And that to me is the difference right now between the market sort of growing at a faster rate than what it actually is. But it's definitely, like I say, improved on where it was last year. And that's going to be a key message as well.
Motivation and capacity.
Yeah.
That's it.
But are there any tools available online for someone to kind of check that affordability, or do you think they should be rocking up to a mortgage broker or a bank?
I think it's good to go and test. There's plenty of calculators out there which you can go and test that. But because there's these regulations, and if you said to a first-home buyer, can you buy now, right now? I don't have a 20% deposit. 40% of all first-home buyers right now are buying with less than a 20% deposit.
Wow.
So you don't need a 20% deposit. And in fact, almost half of all are not using it. There is a restriction there, so most need it, but not everyone. And so to find out whether you can qualify for that, you probably need to talk to an advisor or go direct to your current bank.
Brilliant.
And same thing around debt to income restrictions now. You might sit there and go, I have to borrow more than 7 times my income or 6 times my income for an owner occupier. So you don't bother talking to anyone. Go and talk to someone, because you might find that you are the person that can use the speed limit that's allowed there because you've got a good history, or you've got good equity elsewhere, or there's, you've got good growth potential in your job. And so the bank and the Reserve Bank will be willing to let you get that borrowing outside the limit because you've got really strong growth potential in your income.
Fantastic.
And they know that you'll soon be able to get below that speed limit, for example. So nothing beats personal interaction. And I'll say that over and over again, but the online tools are great to get a starter. I would hate for someone to go in there and say, you can't borrow this, or you can only borrow this amount. So then they go, I can't buy the property I want. So they give up. It's go and actually talk to someone, and definitely go and track what's happening with properties too.
That's great advice.
Sure, I'm quite curious. We're having this chat, and we're lucky because we get to have this one-on-one chat, right? But I'm kind of going to ask the questions that occur to me that I hope maybe you're thinking about it. If now, it sounds like you're saying now's a great time to buy. If now's such a great time to buy, how come there's so much property on the market? Surely people would be saying, well, if now's a great time to buy, I'll just wait a bit longer. yet there's plenty of available stock.
Yeah, really good point. And I think one thing that's probably been lost in some of the commentary about high-level listings right now is it's not because heaps of people are listing their property. The flow of properties being marketed or being listed for sale every week has been consistent for the last year or two. Right. The reason that the large number of properties available for sale today is because of those sales transactions. They haven't been selling very quickly. And so properties are staying on the market longer. But right now, in the last week or so, we've actually seen the total number of listings available for sale start to fall away, and falling away a little bit sooner than they otherwise would at this time of the year because those transactions have lifted. And so I think now we're starting to see that turn in the market where it's not necessarily going to be a strong buyer's market forever. And so yes, you've got that feeling now where there's no desperation to purchase. That might not be around forever. And I'm not saying go crazy and, we don't want to see those prices take off once again either and pay anything the vendor's asking, but you're definitely getting to a time now where that equilibrium's coming. And when you look also at a chart by region of listings compared to a year ago, total number of listings, there are some regions where there's fewer properties available for sale today than there was a year ago.
Right.
And so it's not the case across the country. So let me pull up a quick chart on this one.
Put these up over the screen.
Yeah, so the chart I'm going to show here is a regional chart comparing listings today, total number of listings available for sale today compared to a year ago. On the right-hand side of the chart, you can see places like Gisborne, Otago, Wellington and Canterbury have more properties available for sale than a year ago. So those areas, there's more of a buyer's market, less desperation. Those on the left-hand side, Northland, Taranaki, Waikato and Bay of Plenty, there's actually fewer properties available for sale today than there was a year ago. And I don't think this gets much coverage in the market.
And Auckland's bang on
essentially the same.
Yeah, no, that's right. So this is, I think, what we're really talking about here is we're talking about the available stock levels, but I get really interested when you compare the volume of transactions, almost the speed of the market, alongside the available stock, because that's effectively I think that's referred to as an absorption rate. And I've heard it said that an absorption rate between 4 to 6 months of inventory is roughly market neutral. Less than 4 months is really a seller's market, and over 6 months is really a buyer's market. Are those accurate figures? Is that true?
Yeah, we don't track a specific figure in terms of that absorption rate itself, but I totally agree that it's a good measure to look at. When you look at transactions compared to a year ago, we've got another chart to show that. Somewhere like Hamilton is up 27% on a year ago in terms of sales volumes. And so you're seeing a real difference there.
Christchurch up almost 10%.
And in general, we're seeing I'd say when I update this chart, they do jump around a little bit because, each month we see a strong month or a slightly weaker month in certain areas. But generally, we're seeing relative consistency around about 10 to 15% growth in transactions year on year. Wellington right now is relatively flat, so we haven't seen that same turnover in Wellington, and kind of goes for all those reasons I spoke about earlier, where the economy is not going so well, and so we haven't seen that same growth come back in Wellington, but there is some value growth coming through too. So that's just sometimes because the purchasing power is there, because high income levels mean that some people out there are paying prices because they can, and they feel confident in their job, and so they're not holding back, but it's not the whole market.
It's so interesting because I've seen this at the Coalface in particular segments of the market which are just budget restricted. So for example, and it's just an area where I was calling a lot of auctions in South Auckland. Plenty of new housing stock, and almost entirely driven by that first home buyer market. And I remember, as the interest rates went up, the purchasing power went down, and buyers typically buying into that are trying to buy themselves the very best house they can in the best location they can afford. They're stretching to the max of their budget. And I remember saying to a seller who was struggling to understand why their property wasn't worth what they'd hoped it was worth, and the reality is that if it's one buyer who's had their purchasing power eroded, that's their problem. If it's your entire market that's had their purchasing power eroded, that's your problem.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. And I think
we're seeing that in reverse in some of these places.
Exactly right. And I think that's where, there's another, one of our key data sets at CoreLogic actually is one that we call our CoreLogic buyer classification series. And so this is where we essentially classify every single purchase of the market into one of 3 main buyer groups. That's a mover, so an owner-occupier moving house, a first home buyer, or a property investor, or a multiple property owner. We call them to get every single type of multiple property owner. And one thing we've seen through that is that first home buyers have generally been pretty strong through this difficult part of the market, this difficult cycle, because you're right. They will stretch as far as they can go. They will adjust their expectations, move a bit further from home. They'll buy that townhouse when I know they want to buy the single standalone dwelling with some lawn, but they will do whatever they can to get into that market because they're buying for personal reasons, they're emotional, and they're buying long term. they've actually been strongest they've ever been in 2024. And we expect them to...
What percentage of the market did they make up?
I think it was around about 26% last year, which is the strongest we've ever seen. And that's despite the challenges we've spoken about, relatively high interest rates compared to recent history, and stretched affordability, but they've managed to find a way. Yeah. They've generally made hay while the sun is shining, which is other buyers have been away. Investors certainly haven't been as active. And those movers who would otherwise look to move house because they've had a change in their lifestyle or life stage, they've had another kid or they want to move to a school zone, they've definitely held back from that market because it's not a necessary purchase. Yeah. And in difficult times, you go, do we really want to take on a larger mortgage when things are quite tough? Maybe we'll wait a little bit longer. We can survive a bit longer. Yeah. So they're less desperate to make that move. Whereas first-time buyers are going, I'm renting. I want to get that property long-term. And so while those movers have been less active, those first-time buyers have been stronger. And investors, we know, over a large number of years now, have dealt with way more regulation. Yeah. The previous government obviously had a lot more restrictions on investor activity, starting to loosen up back again now. But for a long time there, with high interest rates and difficult regulations, investors have naturally pulled back from the market.
The inability to claim interest as an expense, that's almost off now, isn't it?
From now, basically. So for this financial year we've just moved into, you can claim 100% of your interest costs back in your tax return. So that's certainly going to help those investors out. That finances improve. Yeah. You add in even things like the bright line test shortening back to 2 years. Now, on its own, as a purchaser, you go, well, what does it matter? I'm not going to sell in 2 years or in 5 years. But it actually does help because many investors we've spoken to over the period where it was 10 years, they were going, if I purchase a property, my circumstance changes in 5 or 6 years' time, and I sell that property, I have to pay a capital gains tax. Yeah. Now they know if something changes in 3 or 4 years and they have to sell their property, no capital gains tax is going to apply. And so that really has meant that they're not going to have that same uncertainty with purchasing. Yeah. So that brings a few more investors back in. And again, interest rates will almost come back to every single time. Purchasing power increases, expenses reduce, you can buy more, you can go and purchase.
And I've got to tell you, just from having chatted to lots of people about this, that's really important what Nick just mentioned. And I don't know if the policymakers have even thought about this, but the first home that I bought was not a home. I bought an investment property. I was quite young when I did that. I was selling real estate, and my sales manager, Steve Allen, great guy, he said to me, make money selling real estate, build your wealth buying it. And so he really encouraged me to buy an investment property, and I'm so pleased that I did because it's enabled me to do other things off the back of that. But I don't know if I would have been as excited about doing that if I was going to then sell that, have to pay tax on it in order to buy my home. Whereas now actually it's a really good valid choice if you're considering, I don't even know if I really want to live in that particular area, but I could buy a good investment there. It's going to track the rest of the market. And so when I do want to actually get into a family home, I can then sell the investment and move into it. I think it's something that people should be considering.
Yeah, I think we've heard the term rent investors. Yes. Which is that, you can rent your property because you can buy or you can rent in a place you can't afford to buy. Yeah. So you can continue to rent, buy an investment property, which hopefully, you can pay off the mortgage.
And you can buy
100%. And you can hopefully see your equity increase, which, as you said, you can then either leverage to buy your family home or, as you said, maybe sell that property.
Leverage even better. For sure. Yeah.
So I think that's definitely something that, has been talked about a lot more. The opportunity is definitely there. Maybe you want that flexibility of renting as well because you want to be able to move house renting depending on your certain circumstance, whether you're a student or you maybe think you're going to go overseas at some stage. Yeah. So you're buying a different property than you're going to live in. And I think that's a really important thing.
Especially if you're a mover as well, because some places like, if you've got a second child and you're looking to go move into a certain school but you can't afford in the area.
Yep. But you can rent there.
Just rent there, put your house on rent.
Totally.
Rent there and then just see what you go.
Absolutely.
No, that's interesting. And in terms of the first home buyers, like you said, obviously they've stayed strong throughout this period. Do you think the key motivation for them has been the lack of competition or has it been everything combined?
Yeah, I think that the motivation's probably not that there's no competition, but that's enabled them to act upon their motivation, which is I want to buy a house to live in, to grow my wealth, to, likely get something sorted for me in retirement. Like that's the huge motivator for owning your own home, right? Is that hopefully by the time you retire, you then fully outright own that property and you have no housing costs whatsoever. That's the strongest motivator most people have for buying their own property. And then, of course, you can grow on top of that and say maybe an investment property helps you to get some passive income on top of that as well. So I think that motivation is still about having that. And that's the thing you can own, right? You can touch, you can see it, you can improve it, do all those things. Yeah. But then it's about a matter of making the most of the fact that other buyers aren't there. Yeah. And so you don't have that competition. So then you can maybe get a price that works for you, and rather than have to be fighting against other buyers who are out there also trying to purchase that same property that you'd love to live in.
Man, I got to say, just listening to you talk and reflecting on the state of the market right now, man, I just think if you have the ability to purchase and you're planning to purchase, but you are thinking, oh, I've got plenty of time on my side. Do you know what I think? The market at the moment is such that you can probably go and buy the house that you want.
Yeah.
Do you know what? I can remember, and it wasn't that long ago, and I'm not predicting this, by the way, in the near, or probably even the midterm, because I just think it was a crazy hot market. But I do think, based on what you're saying, and I agree, I think we'll see volumes of sales lifting. The current conditions where there's really good opportunities, and I don't mean to buy a bargain, that's out there too, but to actually just buy well, the right sort of property, without experiencing the heartbreak of having missed out on the dream home 3 or 4 times before you got your home. It's there now. Go and buy it.
Yeah, I mean, my question is always, what are you waiting for? Like, if you're actually waiting because you think you're going to get a better bargain, like, you're only going to be left disappointed. If you're financially ready, then again, and you can find a property you like, there's no reason to delay that purchase. If it's again, I'm not sure about my financial circumstances and I don't want to create a big commitment, then sure, delay because of that.
Totally.
That's personal, financial, absolutely. But in terms of going, I'm going to delay because I think prices are going to fall, I'm going to get a better bargain in the future, like, that's a mug's game.
Yeah, we're betting against you at the moment, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Very interesting.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. And we always talk about stats, obviously, and there's quite a lot that we've covered today. But in your professional opinion, what is the right balance of number of stats that you should consider before you go into it? Because it can be easy.
Paralysis by analysis.
Right? Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I mean, I don't think you want to get too bogged down in it. I mean, for an investor, absolutely, you need to, probably have a spreadsheet, do the finances, and you probably want to find some way to almost scenario test. What happens if X happens? If interest rates do this or do that? What happens if my income reduces by this much? So I think it's about scenario testing. That's where you want to make sure you're really financially savvy and working with professionals. Like, I'm not a financial advisor. I'm not going to advise someone that just go and do it. If you're feeling good, talk to someone who's professional. In terms of the stats to understand, again, if you're an owner-occupier buying a property, I think the emotional stuff's more important than any statistics is going to matter anyway. You going and looking at a property and going, I would pay $800,000 for that property, but not actually purchasing it and then waiting to see how much it sells for. Then you learn the market, and then the next property that comes up, kind of what it's going to go for. So I think, while I will analyze data till the cows come home, and I do sit behind my desk and do that, and I love it. For someone that's buying property, for whatever reason, you can't actually beat going and seeing properties, seeing what you'd value it, then see what the market values it, and then learn from that to apply that to the next purchase, the next property.
And ask if it didn't land where you thought it would land, you do need to ask the question why, because it should be a really curious why, and it would be worthwhile talking with the agent, and hopefully they're generous enough to give you a bit of insight, because it could be that there was something that you didn't pick up on about that property, a defect perhaps, or maybe, and these happen, it was just an incredibly superheated auction and those buyers paid a competition price rather than market price because they got carried away. I had one the other day. It was on the market. You're going to laugh at the purchase price, but it was investor type stock in Whangarei. Agent had appraised at 300 to 320. It was a brought forward auction at 300. So the agent said to me, I think there could be a little bit of competition, but it would be interesting to see. 6 bidders in the room. The thing sold for 351,500. It petered out at around about the 320 mark, funnily enough, and went really slow. But then something funny happened because the bidder here and the bidder here, they were eyeballing each other. And we had some great banter. And he even says to me, he goes, are they a first home buyer? And I said, look, I can't tell you, sir. And I said, sure, I think he might be an investor. And he goes, oh, we can't let him have it. But anyway, but it's important to kind of understand those things so that you can actually track the market. And that was I think just really sage advice. If you're trying to work out, the market, pick the sort of property that you want to buy, figure out what you'd pay, see where it sells, ask the question why.
Oh, absolutely. And I think this is why I love my job. This is why I'm so fascinated by it, because it's essentially a study of psychology, biopsychology, right? And that's, I think, almost back to your point earlier, David, around when you're talking to a vendor as to why a property might not sell, who are you appealing? Who's this property appeal to? Yeah. Is it only first-home buyers? Is it a large family trying to get into a school area? Is it an investment property because it's going to rent really well and it's got high yield? Or is it something that you can see strong capital growth in the future? All those reasons are very different as to how you you'd market a property or how you would try and sell that property. And it's the same thing when you're trying to get in the head of other people that might buy that property. If you're a first home buyer and you're looking to buy a property, is it only appealing to other first home buyers, or could upgraders be looking at it, or could investors be looking at it? And that might help you to understand the psychology of who else is going to be wanting to fight hard for that property. You know, is it close to transport links, and so it's going to appeal to someone that's, you know, commuting into town? And there's just so many things, and that's why I'm fascinated, and probably why we could talk for hours about all of this stuff, because there's so many things to weigh up.
What we get to do.
Exactly. Oh, exactly. It's my job. I love it.
So good. So good. I'm interested actually in the investment thing there. You talked about yield. What is a great yield? Where do we see that across the different regions? Because I know it will be changing. Where are the investors most active at the moment? Can you tell us a bit more?
I mean, it's really hard because we do track yield across the country, across each of the different cities. But when you're looking at yield as a statistic, it's relatively low. It'll be 3%, 4%, 5%.
But that's just the average.
Exactly.
What about you mentioned about, you know, tracking a particular type of property class. Do you track investment?
Not directly, and I suppose we do stick to the high level. High level statistics.
Okay.
And so we're more looking at change over time. So yield now is much improved than it was 2 years ago.
Yep.
And so I think
change over time? As in the change.
That's right. So I think, you know, the average yield, say a couple of years ago, would have been 2.5%. Now the average yield will be 3.5%. Right. That's very different in different parts of the country.
How much is that based on purchase price versus increases to rent?
So that'll be based on prices falling and rents have continually increased. And the rate of increase of rent has slowed down. So we've seen strong rent over the last few years, but that growth in rent is now slowing down. So from an investment perspective, things are improved. Again, interest rates have fallen. House prices have fallen, now starting to grow again. Incomes have continued to grow, and that means rents have continued to grow as well. So yield has improved off the back of all of those things.
Yep.
But that rate of yield growth and rate of rent growth is slowing down because migration is slowing now, and demand for rental property is relatively consistent, I would say, but supply of rental property is relatively high. So we've probably talked around a few factors
we've got
there.
A sales market that is stable and slightly strengthening, and we've actually got a rental market that sounds like it is perhaps weaker and weakening.
Well, I'd say it's actually improving from an investments perspective, but not at the same rate.
Property.
But even from a yield perspective, I'd say things are improved today than where they were.
Yes, but is the trend improving, or is it?
But the rate of growth is slowing.
Okay.
So rents are still growing, so yields are still growing off the back of that, but that rate of growth is much more reduced than it was in the last couple of years. And I think it's an important thing to talk about. It's kind of like when you talk about inflation. We're still seeing growth in inflation. Prices are still increasing, but the rate of inflation growth is slowing down.
Yep.
We don't typically see inflation actually decline. That's not a good thing for our economy. Similar to rent, we don't really see rents decline over time very often because mostly rents are a function of tenant income. And incomes are still growing, but the rate of growth is slowing down.
Sure.
The income.
Exactly. The rate of income growth is slowing down. So
ultimately, my little synopsis on that, from having seen this happen very close proximity, at say the apartment market in Auckland post-COVID, like I watched rents drop, 20, 25%, almost overnight as, foreign students, the tourist travel for the Airbnbs all disappeared and they became available for longer term, So it is supply and demand, and that migration thing is interesting. What's migration doing at the moment? Because this affects both segments of the market, sales and
100%. Yeah, really good point to pick up. And I think is that supply and demand is still a factor in the rental market, of course, as well. And as you said, COVID's the perfect example, and the pockets of that with apartments definitely the case. If demand and supply are relatively consistent, that's when tenant income will be the key determinant on rental growth. But definitely supply. From a migration perspective, it's kind of a similar story. Migration is still net positive. There's still more people moving here than leaving, but those numbers are much more reduced than where they were in the past. So I think in the last year, 30-odd thousand positive net migration, but we're coming down from a net positive position of 140,000. So that is a demand for property, and now that's not necessarily buying because it's hard to buy as a foreigner, but that means, when more people are moving to New Zealand, they need somewhere to live, generally in the rental market. So there is still growth in rental demand, but it's much more reduced than where it was in the past. And with supply increasing as well, that's when you're seeing that equilibrium come through, and that's when you're seeing the greater function being household income and what that income level looks like.
So muted growth.
Okay. So I was going to say that what's influencing that net migration, the decline of it from what the numbers should have been? Is it just because of the cost of living?
What's actually more is the net position has reduced because more people are leaving. And that's because there's greater economic opportunities in Australia in particular, but across other parts of the world, people doing their OE,
We've
for example.
seen these trends before.
Exactly. So we're still seeing people move to New Zealand. You know, we're still relatively attractive on a worldwide basis. But also, if you're someone, say, living, whether it's in Europe, America, Asia, New Zealand's still relatively attractive.
Yes.
But also, those people are considering, should I move to Canada, Australia, England, or America? Maybe they're not going to go to America at the moment because there's lots of uncertainty there. But Canada could be quite appealing. Australia is definitely very appealing, stronger economy than us. And so we're not seeing the same growth in people moving here. At the same time, plenty of Kiwis are looking at that and going, actually, I've got greater opportunities in Australia, plus catching up on some OE.
I can tell you there are plenty of the sellers that I've spoken with. I mean, I must have done about 500 auctions over the last 12 months, and I often speak with the sellers during that process. So many headed to Australia. And these are professional people. There's definitely almost a segment there. I'm giving you the anecdotal experience. I'd love you to either corroborate what I'm saying with the stats or give me some greater perspective outside of my isolated viewpoint. But I feel like there's two groups there. There's the groups that are like, I'm just going to say, New Zealand-born New Zealanders who have grown up here. Maybe they've gone abroad in the past. They've come back. They're professional. They're relatively asset rich. They've done okay. They're good, but they're going, man, we can do so much better in Australia, and I'm going to go and do that. And so they're selling their house, and they might even be getting less than they could have got, but they're not phased because they've got bright futures there. And then there's another group, and these people got really pinched. And I'm going to talk about South Auckland, but I'm interested in what the stats say in other areas. They bought in peak times, and they are taking a bloodbath because they're losing their entire deposit, but they're still choosing to make the move because they're, I'm going to say, newer New Zealanders, and New Zealand was their home. They put the roots down, they bought property, and they've still uplifted and gone, you know what, I've got better opportunities. I mean, I think it's really sad, but it's definitely something I've seen firsthand. Yeah,
I think both of those cases are very true, and it is a case across the market. And I think the key thing there is that for a transferable skill, for the same job you can do in New Zealand, you can generally do the same job in Australia and get paid more. So for anyone in that position, it feels like the opportunities are greater, and depending again where you live and, the connectedness, our investment in infrastructure over a long period of time hasn't been great. So we don't have great public transport, for example, and you can go to Australia, much better train system. So you can live maybe further from the centre city, do the similar job, get paid more, and then if you do have to go to the city, it's much more cheaper and affordable, and you're not spending the same time commuting either. So I think for most of those situations, it's absolutely more appealing, and you can't begrudge those people going for those reasons. And so that's a key problem that New Zealand Inc., if you want to call us, has to try and solve for how we can continue to be more appealing in that position, because we just don't pay the same wages, because we don't have the same broad-based economy as they do in Australia, where they can pay more for some of the similar jobs.
Man, well, what do we need to do to get a better economy? How should New Zealand become more productive? I'm going to be really facetious here. Have we become too fixated on property?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably a part of it. We talk about the property market not being necessarily as productive an industry. It can be, because if you are buying a property, improving the quality, that is feeding to the productive economy by hiring builders and other people. So there is a section of it which does work, but otherwise it is relatively passive. If we have more entrepreneurs and we're trying to encourage more investment in actual businesses here in New Zealand, then that can be more productive. And we need to be smarter about how we work. So we're not just working longer hours to get more money. We're actually working smarter to earn the same amount of money or more on a fewer hours, so that we can then go and invest that in the community or in other parts of the economy as well. Now, that's a pretty big question as to how we improve that. And it needs strong investment from public sector, government spending more, probably from foreign investment as well. We need more foreign investment, businesses looking here and going, there's opportunities in New Zealand. There's been some changes recently in government saying they're happy to support digital nomads. You can work for an international company and live in New Zealand because it's appealing to do so. And maybe we get some taxes that help that out as well. So there's different ways of doing that. The big thing, I think, is we need to see stronger investment in big investment projects. And again, you'd say the government, as well as the opposition have been talking about wanting to almost have an agreement between the two to invest better in infrastructure, have longer term plans, that as soon as we have a change in government, we don't see them scrap the last lot and do a whole new one again. So we need to see that bipartisan agreement to invest long term in infrastructure.
Yeah.
Again, businesses, people can plan for that, and we can see that, investment here in New Zealand.
Foreign investment. You mentioned that. I've said a couple of times here, and I've heard it mentioned that potentially a certain price point, we might be saying, hey, some of the finest real estate in the world is going to become available to anyone. Is that likely to happen? Do you think? Is it just a bit of posturing, or is it actually part of policy rollout? And will it make a difference?
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, because I think we've heard it for a while now, and you're never quite sure if it's just the market trying to talk the government into it. Because obviously there are a lot of people that would benefit from having more buyers looking at property here in New Zealand, and the government would benefit too, especially if, as was talked about prior to the election, there was a tax put on, like I said, for property above $2 million, let's say, which was talked about at the time, maybe $5 million, who knows. We've always said we don't really think it is likely to happen. A big reason for that is the fact that Winston Peters is part of this government, and he's been a direct opponent of this type of policy and wanting to not see residential property sold to foreigners. He's part of the coalition government, of course. Now, who knows, he could change his stance on that if there's good reason to. And one of the things that made me consider this a bit more was in the last month or two, we did see the government announce some changes to what they call the golden visa, and trying to encourage investment into business in New Zealand and being able to get residency off the back of that.
What exactly is the golden visa?
It basically means that if you invest in businesses here, that you can get a New Zealand visa here in New Zealand. So it's trying to encourage people to invest in New Zealand businesses and go, if you do that, we will then allow you to become a New Zealand visa holder. But the big problem with that, or the big maybe pushback on that, is saying, yeah, fine, that might get people attracted to New Zealand, but if they can't buy a property to live in, then maybe they won't even bother investing in the businesses. And that's when I go, okay, if that is true, which I believe it, then maybe they go, cool, if we really want to get investment in New Zealand businesses, you might need to look at loosening the foreign buyer rules as well. And then you might say, yeah, okay, 5 mil or 2 mil, put some tax on it.
I think it's the ordinary resident criteria for that makes it hard, because sure, you can get the visa, but if you're not ordinarily resident, then you can't buy the house. And so there may, some relaxing of some of those rules could potentially be useful to the actual overall aims of that policy.
That's right. So it's like, how much true investment will you get if they can't actually own residential property to live here as well? Now, of course, we know Australians can buy property here. If you're a Singapore resident, you can do so as well. And you can go through the foreign buyer office to still purchase if you're outside of that, but it's a pretty laborious process. So it's not likely to happen. So that's where the talk becomes, I think, a bit more real. But in honesty, I haven't heard any true consideration from anyone in government that's looking at this and going, what if we did this? What sort of tax would we raise? And how much foreign investment might come off the back of that? So it still feels like a little bit of postulating, like you said, but maybe it's a bit more real than I would have said 6 months ago.
If you're sitting on a real estate gold mine, you've got an absolutely stunning $10 million property on Waiheke Island. By the way, I look forward to seeing you later on. Probably not worthwhile waiting for a change in policy.
I don't think so. I don't think there's anything that tells us it's happening soon, and it would be a change in policy, which we know never happens quickly. But I think there's a potential we see it change in the future, but it might take some time.
Okay. Mate, I'm interested, just I guess coming back into some of your stats and things. I'm asking you the things that are in my mind, but what haven't we asked? What should we be asking? And if you were someone looking at the property market and trying to work out, is it a good time based on my situation and what I plan to do? Those are the unknown criteria. But what else should they be thinking about to help influence the decision? Is it a good time? Yeah,
I think for me, from an investment perspective, I think I'd probably hone in on. One of the key things we've been talking about recently is what's our expectation for long-term growth. And you'll hear so often in the market, house prices in New Zealand have doubled every 10 years for the last 4 decades. So it will forever and forever. And I'm a big hater of that saying, mostly because it has done that. That's a true statement, but mostly it's for good reason. There's a number of factors that have led to that doubling of house price growth for a number of decades, and so we've been stepping through why is that. And there's been a bit of academic research that's been released the last few years talking about that. And if I run through them quickly, generally it's the significant falling of interest rates over that period of time, over multiple decades. You mentioned earlier, parents 20% interest rates down to 5% now. You can't see that same shift, that same scale of shift again. That is a strong strong contributor to strong house price growth in the past that we can't necessarily see happen again. The other one is land use and restriction on land use. So yes, things aren't perfect right now. You can't necessarily build anything anywhere, but it's much more improved now than it was, say, 20 years ago. We've got the Auckland Unitary Plan now, which encourages more development, more intensification of properties in areas where people want to live, supported by the right infrastructure. So that's going to mean less house price growth in the future because we don't have the same restrictions that we did in the past. Doubling of household incomes. In the last couple of decades, we've now gone to a situation where in most households, 2 people earn income, not one like we saw 3 or 4 decades ago. What does that do? If you double your household income, your borrowing power increases, you can borrow more, you can pay more for a property. And so we saw strong growth in property prices over multiple decades because of that doubling of household incomes. That can't necessarily happen again.
That was a doubling, not of real income growth, but the fact that now it's both people working.
Yeah, exactly. And that's now established.
Unlikely to see it change to having 3 or 4.
Well, we could. Maybe we do. Maybe households change.
Yeah, maybe that is. And certainly I would say it's really been interesting to watch some of the new developments and that sought after, home and granny, that multi-dwelling that has been popular.
There's way to do it. There's no doubt there's ways to do it, but it's still going to be small pockets of the market rather than market-wide, which is almost everyone double their household income.
It won't be a significant change.
Exactly. I think there's examples of developers I know in Lower Hutt who were building essentially, I almost call them turnkey, but they were building like properties for 2 professional couples. So they would almost be able to live separately, but they were contributing to a property where they could get their equity up, have a shared space, yes, of course, so they could maybe build their equity for 5 years and then they could maybe go separately later on. Really well, and still seem to be going really well. So I think they've seen that a real success. It's kind of like flatting. You'd have 4 of you flatting together, 2 couples. You're kind of maybe not quite married. You're happy to flat with other people, but not forever. And so you do that as a way to get into the market. You've still got maybe 2 bathrooms, so you've got your own areas that are separate.
To co-ownership.
Exactly. Exactly right. Co-ownership for a period, knowing that later on they want to move from that. But if that's what happens, because then you've got 4 incomes, you can get a pretty decent new property and then again build up your equity to be able to then use that later on. So I think there's ways that can change, but as the scale of doubling household incomes, probably not quite. So again, when you're looking at what role that might have in the future, not to the same degree that we've seen in the past. So there's 3 factors that have led to that doubling of household income over multiple decades. And when we talk about that, doubling of household incomes essentially means compound annual growth rate of the property prices around about 6.5% per annum every single year, year on year, for 40 years. That's basically what the market's done. Yes, it's gone through cycles, but it's done that over a long period of time. If none of those factors can happen to the same degree, then maybe we don't expect that 6 or 7% growth to happen in the future over a long period of time again. And maybe that growth rate looks closer to 3 or 4%, which is much more in tune with household income, because as we grow more income, we can borrow more, we can pay more. So property price growth in the long term might be more in tune with household income growth as opposed to that 6 or 7% rate. And the other factor that is a bit more speculative is what really happens with regulations. Debt to incomes. We haven't had them in the past, now we do. That's going to reduce real demand long term. Investors can't buy as many properties. They can't increase their portfolio at the same speed as they could in the past. That is going to slow down that growth rate. Loan to value ratio restrictions, they've been in place for more than 10 years now, but not for 40 years. So again, that's just limiting how much people can borrow and how quickly they can get into the market. That's another factor that will reduce house price growth in the future. And the last one, which is highly speculative, and it is at some stage in the future, we may see a shift in our tax base away from income tax towards some form of land tax, wealth tax, or significant capital gains tax. Now, it's a bit speculative on my part. Like I said, we don't know that's going to happen, but as generations come through, baby boomers retire, maybe some of that wealth needs to shift to the lower, or to future generations, to the next generation, and there has to be some form of switch to not be disadvantaging income tax, going up there and working. And again, it comes to the productivity side of things, right? You go and work more, you don't get much more because you just get taxed more. So if we shift that towards some form of wealth, land, or capital growth tax, then you might see that also contribute to less growth in the future.
Totally. I mean, you can see the tussle that policymakers have, because as you're talking about, introducing those things, I just think to myself, I'm like, I could see why they would do it. And I could also see some
pushback will always be there.
And not just from the people people who live here, but does that make New Zealand an attractive place to come and be if you're one of these foreign investors that we want to attract to help make the economy more productive? Maybe not.
But that's also where you go, for businesses, you could bring your business tax rate down, right?
Yeah.
So when you've got a really efficient and productive business, don't tax that so much and don't tax the income so much, but look at some or other form. And maybe land tax is the best way to do it, because that encourages the best use of that land as well. Put as many properties on that piece of land, so that then that small percentage of land tax you're paying, which is kind of like a council rate, I suppose, it's still encouraging the best use of that land as well. And maybe that's the shift.
Man, it'll be so fascinating to see. As you say, there's definitely the possibility of this stuff. And so it sounds like whilst we've got some short-term forecasting here for a little bit of growth, long-term forecasting is that we will see growth, but that growth is likely to be muted from what it has been in the past.
Exactly right. And I think the lesson from there, of course, comes to then, so if you're buying a property and it's a long-term expectation or it's an investment property, trying to make sure that you're buying it based on the yield, how much actual, what's your cash flow going to look like on that property? See capital growth as a bonus. You want to have some forecasts in there, but put it at the lower end of maybe 3%, and anything above that is a genuine bonus, as opposed to buying it and going, I hope and need this to grow by 5, 15 or 10, 15%.
Speculation.
Exactly, right? And so I think setting an expectation back at that level and going, buy an investment based on yield, not future capital growth, is a much more healthy market to have as well, rather than people going, I'm going to buy this and hope for 20% growth in the next 10 years.
It's going to double in the next 10 years.
Exactly. 100% right.
I'm curious to know what you think about the New Zealand, I think two questions here. One is about the New Zealand property market, and the other one is about the New Zealand economy in the context of world markets and world economies. We've talked a lot about what's happening here domestically, but I feel like, and I don't know if this just happens through every generation, but I go, man, I feel like over the last 5 years, I've lived through a crazy time. I've had a pandemic, and I've seen, freedoms taken away and changed in ways I just never would have even imagined would happen. And then we've forgotten about it. And then, we've got the Cook Islands, having a chat to China and not telling us about it, and you've got Winston Peters condemning it, and then the next thing you know, there's a bloody Chinese warship in the Tasman. And the crazy thing about that is, because I've often looked at the China-Taiwan kind of conflict and threat, and I said to my wife when Winston was making these comments, I said, you watch this, the next thing and I thought I was kind of joking. I said, the next thing you know, they'll be doing bloody live firing demonstrations, out here in the Hauraki. Well, they weren't far off it. So there's this crazy global, thing happening at the moment where America's star is waning, and they're doing everything they can to change that. I don't think the economy in China is great at the moment, but they're still a real dominant power. You've got Russia and Ukraine. Anyway, there's other things that I'm sure of course, what about Palestine and Israel? The world is a crazy place. How does that, I hope this doesn't happen, but let's just say the economic wars, like America's about to put tariffs on, I believe that's being announced today. That's an economic war. What happens? How do we factor in this?
I think it's worth acknowledging that we are a relatively small place in the global scheme of things. Not to say we're not impacted by all these things. Of course we are. We're a large export country, and so the tariffs are going to have an impact here. Generally, it's going to mean that inflation will be higher, and so it's going to cost more. And so that actually might have an impact that the official cash rate doesn't fall by the rate we were previously expecting. And I think the key thing of all of the things you've spoken about, David, is it's uncertainty, and uncertainty is not good for anybody. And I think the other thing as well is that, free trade is definitely a good thing for global economy. Everyone closing down and putting tariffs on is not good for many individual economies in itself. So it's not going to really mean good things for anybody around the world. So then it's about how does this play out, and what could some reversal look like as well. And now look, we're getting into hugely speculative territory in terms of where that goes. In terms of what we can do about it, look, I think the thing for me is really looking at the key policy decision makers, and that really comes back to the Reserve Bank. So I pay a lot of attention to their monetary policy statement, their financial stability report. How do they assess these risks? Because they're the ones that are going to influence us in New Zealand by the cost of money, by what inflation looks like, their influence over that. So I'm not saying ignore it completely, and people are going to have their opinions as to, is the stuff in America an upside risk or a downside risk? What's happening in China? What could the wars have? Of course, that's going to have some some people are going to have different opinions on that.
Question to you, I want you to talk about the Reserve Bank. I think that's a really important piece of the conversation we need to have. But before we quite get to that piece, let's just ask that question. Is the global instability an upside or downside risk? Does all that stuff happen, kick the property market off, or does it mute it down and there's actually is downside risk, even though we just felt like it was quite stable? What's your take?
Yeah, so I think the global risk is inflation is higher than it otherwise would have been because of that uncertainty. Higher inflation means you don't want to reduce the price of money here, so the OCR doesn't drop by as far as it otherwise would had we had a more consistent and normal global economy. So I think the risks are to the downside for the property market because the OCR doesn't fall as far as it otherwise would have.
Yep. So we're basically saying this likely impacts the cost and supply of money. So therefore, it brings us really neatly to that chat about what's the OCR 3.75 right now.
That's right. Yep.
What sort of margin do banks expect to trade on, and what's the forecasting for that OCR, and I guess the supply of money. If we need to stimulate the economy, can the government print more money?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely, and they can definitely continue to make that OCR lower as long as they're comfortable with inflation.
Yes, exactly. So they probably won't.
That is their key point right now, right? And they're confident that it's within the 1 to 3% band that it needs to be at. Not just that it needs to be within 1 to 3. They've talked regularly. They want it at the midpoint. They want inflation hovering around 2%. It's pretty close to that. But the key thing keeping that inflation low is global costs have reduced. Local prices are still high because insurance costs, rates, those things are still keeping our inflation above where it otherwise would be. So inflation, there's probably risks to the upside, which means the Reserve Bank will be cautious with continuing to cut the official cash rate at the rate that they've been declining so far, multiple 50 basis point cuts. There's a decision next week. We do expect the Reserve Bank to follow through with what they set their expectation was a few weeks ago, which is to cut by a further 25 basis points, taking it to 3.5%. That means maybe a little bit more downward pressure on some of those short-term rates, but the 6 and 12-month rate haven't moved that much recently because they're baking in these cuts to the OCR anyway. And I think the impact of the tariffs coming on will be the Reserve Bank might not follow through with a third cut potentially. Right. So maybe we see one next week, maybe one more at the end of May, and then it'll be what they call data dependent. They will absolutely wait and see what is the flow on impact to economies, to inflation, before they get too carried away with yet another cut to the OCR in future, and see what people are doing. Where are people fixing? Are people now taking the longer term view? Get that 2-year rate for 4.99, go and get that now. That'll push out that expectation of where the market goes to in the future as well, and helps those banks to set their stock up as well, because if they can now have some longer term certainty with the mortgages they're putting out there because they know they're paying 4.99, then that's going to make them more certain with what's going on in the future as well. And so we'll start to see that flow through.
Yeah. So we've talked a lot, I think, almost analysing for people that might be making a decision to buy or not, but I actually think man, we should be chatting about what do I do with my mortgage? I'm millions in debt. What should I do? Should we be taking the best 5-year rate we can get? Why don't we have 10, 20-year rates like they do in the UK?
Yeah, I truly can't answer that particular question. It's all to do with the way the banks are funded and the way, whether they're getting the money from overseas or whether they're getting it locally, and the way that they have to obviously cover off the way that they're borrowing that money to then lend it to our borrowers here in New Zealand. Why it's so different here than it is in Australia. America, you can get 30-year fixed mortgages. Australia, most people float their mortgage. It's just different ways that our funders get their money and then how they fix that or how they are pricing that into their costs. I don't know all the finances of how that works, but it's just the way our market seems to be stocked.
Are laughing all the way to the bank.
To their funders, yes.
Yeah. So are we more of a short-term market then in that sense?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's just the way the banks are funded. They don't have that same certainty long-term. We don't have the same scale in New Zealand that you do in America or in Australia, and so it's funded differently, and so they have to balance that out with how they fund their mortgages.
So what's that take then on, what's a great rate at the moment for a 5-year loan?
I don't know what the 5-year rate would be. It's probably still sitting in the 5.5s maybe.
Hey, that's in the history of at least my experience, it's not a rate, right?
Yeah.
Maybe now's a bloody good time to lock in.
And I mean, again, not a financial advisor, so I cannot tell someone what they should be doing. I have to always get that in there. But and my thing is always,
by the way, I'm providing zero financial advice, just for clarity.
But the thing for me,
it's for me. But you can't provide me advice.
I didn't provide you financial advice either. Okay. But I think the way that even if friends talk to me about this, right, and the way I do it is basically throw them back to a question, is to say, what is most important to you? Do you want certainty? And the way I try to say it's like I talked about earlier, to try and forecast a scenario, would you be more annoyed if you fixed for longer and rates came down a little bit, so you missed out on the margin, or if you fix short term and then you miss one of those nice long terms, like, like I said, at the bottom of the market, and some people got a 3-year or 5-year rate for under 3%,
Wow.
Absolutely aced it for a long period of time, right? But if the rate had improved after that point, how annoyed would they have been that they actually locked in at a higher rate and it could have got lower a little bit later on? So I always go, which will you be more annoyed about? And that also takes into account, what's your financial situation? Do you think you're going to get strong growth in your income? Is there a chance you're going to reduce your income because maybe you're going to have a child soon? In which case, fix your mortgage cost as low as possible so that you're not going to have an increased burden later on. What if interest rates go up in a year's time and then you lose your job? How much of a problem is that going to be for you in the future? So there's so many things to weigh up, which is why I say you can't give, even if I could, I can't give advice to anyone without knowing their personal situation. But I definitely think that switch to the longer term rates, away from the 6 and the 12 month towards those 2s, which are under 5%, are becoming really attractive. And the way I try and figure it out is to go, well, if the terminal OCR, which is essentially the lowest point we think the OCR will get in the next, say, year or two, and the terminal rate is 3 or 3.25%, you assume a margin there of 1.5% to 2% for the banks. You're looking at something in the 4.5% to 5% mark is as low as those rates are going to get. Which tells me if you can get anything in that rate right now, in that range, maybe it's worth looking at as an option, because it's unlikely rates are going to get much further below that. Now, much like my forecast for house prices, being 3 or 4% is going to be incorrect. There's going to be cycles where it'll be up and it'll below that. Same thing here, right? There's a chance official cash rate goes below 3%. It has done before in the past, and we don't know what external shock could come around. So you might fix for that 4.79, maybe you can get that, and then in the future it drops below, and you're like, damn, why did I fix for that 2 or 3 year rate at 4.79? Not that's available right now. When things have actually dropped below that. But it'll be some external shock. It could be the impact of the war getting worse. It could be the impact of the tariffs that are much more greater than we expect. And actually, flip side of we expect them to have an increasing impact on interest rates. Maybe for some reason it flips the other way. Or China's impact in their economy not doing so well, their property market's not going so well. Maybe that has a broader impact and forces interest rates lower. Not expected to happen, but something could happen. Maybe we go back into lockdown, some sort of pandemic, who knows? But those things could have a factor that, none of us can foresee. And so you just want to figure out what are the scenarios here that could occur and which side of it do I want to be on.
So what you're saying is that obviously evaluate the external variables of what you're facing and then potentially look at what are the margins that you're comfortable with.
Exactly.
Because if you're going, hypothetically speaking, if I'm locking in a 4.79 for 5 years, but if I go, if it's 4.5, that margin I'm comfortable with, but it allows me to actually have my finance in place for the next 5 years.
Certainty. The price of certainty.
Then you might consider that.
That's right.
And be okay with that.
Well, see, people have been taking the 6-month rate for a while now, even though it's higher than the 12-month rate. And if you actually sit down and say, if I take the 6-month rate, what does that 6-month rate need to be? Or what does the rate I take in 6 months need to be to mean it's not as worthwhile as taking that 12-month rate today, which is actually cheaper? And often you're actually expecting quite a significant fall because those interest rates have priced in further falls to come, right? And so those pricing teams are pretty onto it. They know what they're doing. They're trying to ensure that they don't end up on the wrong side of that either. And so, it's really whether you want to hedge your bets on the upside or downside.
It's very fascinating. CoreLogic, obviously, we're super grateful for the stats that you've shared with us, and the business operates not only in New Zealand. So I guess the other part of looking outward was not just at the economy, but I'm curious about the New Zealand property market. We're all about hitting a home run in real estate. What are those other markets like? How does New Zealand compare to what you see? Where are the main markets that you provide stats and track? The US, Australia?
CoreLogic's got a strong presence in the US, the UK and Australia. We do have other parts around the world, but those are our 4 main markets. We're obviously, because of where we're based, we're really close to the Australian market. That Australian market, from a property perspective, has been much more robust. What they've seen is that as interest rates declined, they saw a much quicker reaction because they float their rates. And so people essentially, as soon as interest rates fall, they're paying less in their mortgages. And so they've seen that market react much faster. Same thing on the way up again too, by the way. So the Australian market hasn't been through the same up and the same down as us in New Zealand.
Right.
America's very different again because they've got this long fixing cycle. One thing it has done is meant turnover slowed down a lot, because if you got a mortgage and you're paying a 30-year interest rate of 4%, you don't want to sell that property or move on, because then you're going to have to fix onto new rates. And you can otherwise stay on that 4% interest rate or 3% interest rate for 30 years. So everyone just goes, I'm not moving, and so they stay in their house. So it slows the market down. So that's quite different as well, whereas we do have a much more mobile market here, but nothing like the Australian one. So there's interesting comparisons there. We talked about the Australian economy too, stronger in Australia, more robust, and so we're seeing that flow through to greater growth in the Australian property market. Those are probably the two key things. When I think about CoreLogic though, we are a really broad industry or broad business providing to a lot of different industries. And I suppose while I've got the time, one of the things I did want to talk about was, well, we're mostly known for the work that we do to provide data and stats to media, to consumers, to banks, to real estate agents, to insurance companies. We do a lot more than that. And we've got a really strong geospatial data business as well, where we actually supply all the data to telcos, utilities, road networks. All of our data supports the emergency services in New Zealand to make sure they can get to a location. If you call 111, they're using CoreLogic data.
Wow.
And so that's where a key part of what we do is about accurate data as well. So it's fast data, it's accuracy, it's to the consumer or to the end user as fast as possible through whatever means they need. And that's using, whether it's an API, whether it's using the products we have like Property Guru, which agents will use, or whether it's through the data that we provide through banks as well, which often if you go get a mortgage, they're using our data to understand how much they can lend to you as a consumer as well. So yeah, it's a fascinating industry to be part of. It's a fascinating business to be part of. And one thing to look out for, it's a wee while away yet, is we will be changing name in the future too, in the next couple of months to Cotality. So look out for that one.
Oh, Cotality.
What's
the meaning behind Cotality?
I think the key parts to it is we're a vital business, vitality. We're totality. We're about everything. And we're cooperative. We're about working with people, working with businesses to help them to, provide to their end user, their customers as well. So we're cooperating, cooperating with them to help their users do more.
I love that. And I would say a couple of things. I think certainly one of my goals as a professional in the space is to help people to be able to make good decisions. And, the quality of the information largely influences the quality of the decision that can be made. So having great, accurate insights is so important. And I just want to thank you so much for that collaborative approach. It's great working with you. It's been awesome to have you here again, Nick. Thank you so much.
No, thank you so much. And yeah, totally agree. It's about what we're about, getting that information, but also knowing that even though we do all that stuff, we can't do everything on our own. And that's where we try and have those partnerships and talk to people out in the market to do things together as well, because you can't do it all on your own.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And there's a lot of data that you guys consume.
We take a lot in, we try and package it up and then make it available, and hopefully that's been consumable
but
for
it's
people.
been amazing to actually humanize a lot of that data. And I think that's important for the listeners and the watchers out there to actually form their opinion on what's the stats, but just to kind of have a really good insight into what is happening in the market, how to read those numbers, and then obviously seek a professional advice to be able to go and make that right decision, whether it's buying the first one or the second one or an investment per
to apply that to a decision.
Correct. So that's been really, really good, and we'll definitely be having slides of yours to showcase to.
And we need to bring up that. We also need to bring up that spot on the website that you were talking about with and things. Yes. That's bloody brilliant. I went down and did a presentation in Queenstown the other day, and before doing it, I literally how much is available on the market, how many sales happened in the last couple of months, so that I could work out the absorption rate, so I knew whether I was dealing with more of a seller focused or more of a buyer focused. I'd ask the anecdotal questions, but I wanted the stats. But it's great to actually just have somewhere we can just go and actually see the heat of the market just in real.
Also, the way we like to see people use us is that we are an independent voice. We don't care if the market's going up, going down, if listings are coming up or not. It doesn't matter to us. And then that other people can use that and go, this is in my opinion, this is CoreLogic data, CoreLogic's opinion, and then that can help them to provide that centralized, neutralized advice to help their people to make better decisions as well.
Fantastic. And there's that map.
There's the map.
Yeah, good as gold. We'll bring that up on screen. Mate, we've got a question for you.
Go.
Yeah. Well, Harps, you want to do it?
So we have a tradition on our podcast where the people we've interviewed last would leave us a question for the following guest. So the question they left us with was, it's a little bit deep conversation.
It's good. It's good. We're going to
Should I settle in or what?
This is
Well, it's quite deep though, isn't it?
Totally.
So the question was that if you had 7 days to live, what would you do tomorrow?
Wow.
Exactly.
it's deep.
Wow. My first thought goes to doing something with my family. I've got young family. I've got a daughter who's 10, son who's almost 8, another daughter who's just turned 5.
Oh, nice.
So I think creating some sort of memorable experience with them would have to be my go-to. We talk about traveling at some stage in the future when they're a bit older and they can have these memories of the travel we do. But I think fast forwarding that probably and bringing that forward and doing a Disneyland or something like that would probably be something I think that we'd have to go and enjoy. Yeah, and I'll probably try and sneak in something around a huge sports event. I'm a big avid sports watcher, love my football, play football, love watching rugby, love watching cricket. So if I could squeeze in, or even American sport, just the hype of it all, squeeze in a big sports event, spend lots of time with the family to create some lasting memories, and then, happily whisk off.
You said football, do you mean soccer?
Soccer, yes.
Okay, but
yes.
say football, that's fine, because I'm from UK, so I say football as well.
Well, we're New Zealand football here, but you're right, being a rugby team is not good. Well, Wellington Phoenix is my team.
Oh, yeah.
But my English Premier League team is Manchester United.
Shake on.
Not set up.
My dad would be not happy about this. Foxes, Leicester City. Yeah.
Oh, okay. No one minds the Foxes. That's good. Everyone loves the fairy tale.
You won the
Foxes
league
a few years ago.
Well, that was an incredible season. I don't really follow that closely. I sort of vicariously through my father. But anyway.
Fantastic. Fantastic.
Mate, you get to leave a question for the next
And what would be your question?
I'm trying to think on those sort of similar lines, really. Maybe something like, if you could retire anywhere in the world, where would that be and why?
Oh, that's a great question.
And if you had to answer that one?
Well, it's New Zealand. It's going to be somewhere in New Zealand. I actually grew up in Whangarei.
Right.
So when it comes to rugby, I'm a Northland Taniwha man. And the region of 1,000 beaches, as we call Northland, I think it would be somewhere up there.
Yeah.
Great climate, and still obviously great accessibility to large centres like Auckland. So yeah, some remote beach I could find. I don't know if you guys know much about Matt Watson, the fisherman, and he's got this dream home he built like somewhere up north. I don't know where it is.
Yeah.
And obviously
That's why it's so good.
He's got to be concerned about the impact of climate change, like he's right up near the beach and he talks about it. He obviously is very mindful of that, but there's something about this place he is. He can take his boat out from his front lawn. There's just something about that beach setting, relax, take it easy.
Winterless north.
Exactly.
It's so good.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And all my family's still back there, so I have the connection with the whānau too, which would be great.
Oh, fantastic.
I think that's such a great question, actually. I tell you what, to every single one of you out there, you should actually think not just about retirement, but I don't know how much thought we really give to choosing where we live.
Yeah. Where's home?
But where your home is has such a huge impact on the people you meet, the things you do, the experiences you have, on the life that you lead. And I think a lot of people probably just sort of, I don't know. My wife and I spent a lot of time thinking about our choices about where to live. And I'm so pleased that we did, because it's been a wonderful experience as a result. But it's a
you live
great
in
question.
Waiheke, so actually, taking that boat, the ferry over to the island must be quite refreshing.
I don't want to talk too much about it because I don't want the secret to
Everyone has to get there, yeah.
I don't want the secret to get out, because that's the beautiful thing. It's like living in a little country village. It's like 10,000 people, but we're so close to Metro Auckland. Exactly. Split time between the two. Anyway, I shouldn't be talking about this. It's quite special.
No, but too, I think you're right. It should be a conscious decision, right? You don't just go through the motions and, that's what my job is or whatever, challenge your norm maybe.
Yes.
And actually have to think about, why do you live there? What do you, what are the things that you enjoy? And that's, I think for us, Wellington works perfectly for us. I moved there after university and almost immediately became part of the community. It was through my local football club, Island Bay Football. I was made to feel at home there. My son's now playing for the football club. The kids can walk to school. You've got all those things that matter for someone bringing up a family. I don't think it's us forever in Wellington, but certainly for us right now. And we've got a great office there. We've got everything that we really need right now, but I totally agree. It's a conscious decision for now. But life stage changes, things change, and our priorities will change as well. So it'll be a key thing in future.
Nick, it's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you
so
both very much.
Thank you.
So good to be here. Appreciate having you on.